I do as I'm told. I have been enormously impressed by the organization of this conference. I am very grateful to the organizers for putting together this splendid program. The topic, oh, thank you very much. The topic is very much consistent with the idea of changes, challenges, and chances. That's what I'll be talking about. So those three words apply very much to what I'm going to say. Let me give you first an overview of my, let me see if I can make this happen. This is configured a little differently than ours. Let's see. Help here? The moving? That one. Great. Okay, this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about this morning. I have been working since I was a graduate student with great passion on my lifelong quest to understand how family systems change. And in the last 10 years, I've moved this quest from looking primarily at the United States and to some extent our European and Anglo counterparts in the world to looking more, casting my gaze toward Asia and the rapidly developing parts of the world that are now experiencing large-scale changes in their family systems. I should say that change, when I was a graduate student and studied with the most eminent authority on family change, William J. Good had just finished a book called World Revolution and Family Patterns, talking about global change, but he had no idea, writing as he was in the early 1960s, what kinds of change were going to occur in the West. In some sense, he assumed a stable system in the West and a rapidly changing family system that would converge to Western patterns in the rest of the world. He did not anticipate what demographers have called the second demographic transition. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the growing diversification of family systems, both in the US and throughout the developing world, throughout the West and the East. Is that okay? I'm going to discuss some of the sources of this change and some of the consequences. And those consequences will include growing ramifications for privileged and less privileged family subgroups within populations. And then I'll end with a few brief remarks about policy initiatives that could be contemplated for the future. But indeed, this conference is dedicated to discussion of those policy initiatives. Well, let me say a word about the major changes. This will be familiar to some of you and less familiar to others. But throughout the developing world, the rapidly developing world, and certainly among economically rich nations, marriage, the institution of marriage has changed radically. And part of that change involves the breakdown between the link of sexual initiation or sexual debut and marriage. There was always a kind of fuzzy link in the 20th century where It was possible to have sex before marriage in many countries if there was a commitment to marry. Indeed, marriage, sex, and the potential risk of pregnancy was often an entry into marriage for large parts of the population. But the world that we have entered, beginning in the late 20th century and advancing in this century, is postponement of demographic transitions that were part of the transition to adulthood. Leaving home, finishing school, employment, marriage, and parenthood were the major ones. All of those transitions have become later, and as a result, there's been some pressure on the link between sex and marriage, weakening that link. So in many parts of the world now, and certainly throughout the West, the initiation of sex occurs well before the occurrence of marriage. There has been a growth of gender equity in the workplace and in the family. In some countries, this has been quite radical. In other countries, they are dawdling, you could say, in achieving a greater degree of equity, and I'll say more about that. Lower fertility and an increase in non-marital childbearing is part of the second demographic transition, a constellation of features that have clustered together to create a very different way of managing the early part of the life course. And there's been a growth of childlessness, which I will show you these trends in a moment, and they will be rather vividly displayed. And I've collected data from a number of different countries with the help of the OECD. There are, and I think this is a profound change that is occurring in the US. We see this change occurring to some extent in Europe, to a lesser extent, more in the Anglo countries than the continental Europe. But what I have come to refer to as the two-tiered family system, one for the privileged and one for the less privileged. Whether this will happen in Asia is an open question, or the extent to which it happens. And there's been the converging trends that I'm about to show you in the next set of slides happen differently in different countries. The timing is different, and the constellation of different changes is different, varies. So my friend Francesco Billari and Art Runner have referred to this pattern as a convergence to divergence. In other words, countries are moving in the same directions, but packaging the changes a bit differently. And we'll see that in the graphs I'm about to show. So here's the first of these. And just so you can get oriented, I don't want to do that, back. Okay. Just so you can get oriented here, this is the current, the bars represent the 2012 figures, the black circles, the 1970, 1995 is the white circles. So you can look at the crude marriage rate and see almost everywhere that has dropped. This is Hong Kong, which I don't understand. I looked it up. I do not understand it, and when my research assistant, I asked him to add the Asian countries, Japan and Korea, to this list and put them in red, and Hong Kong as well, of course. but we have a crude marriage rate in Hong Kong that seems almost impossibly high, but I checked it with the Census Bureau. Somebody's going to explain that to me. Okay, so this is a kind of corollary of that. In almost all nations, marriage now occurs later. And here's the kind of mean marriage age, and you can see reaching above the earlier periods for both men and women. Marriage age has been rising everywhere. And this is an important part of the change. Of course, we can begin to understand what's pushing up marriage age, primarily education, and also the requirement of greater skills in the labor market. Certainly when I was growing up, it was very common for people in their late teens to enter the labor market and find employment that would support a family. No longer. That is really, with few exceptions, that pattern has disappeared. Divorce is generally increasing. It's not happened everywhere, but you can see, I think that I need to put my glasses on, but this is Hong Kong over here. So your divorce rate, you'll be happy to know, has now exceeded the US divorce rate. Congratulations. But this represents a real challenge. It's a change with a real challenge to it. And you can see Hong Kong has in no way been exceptional in this movement, but it's very pronounced in Hong Kong. Now this is, I think, what you know and recognize and what was alluded to in a couple of the introductory talks, the opening talks this morning, the rapid decline of fertility. Here again, you see Hong Kong right almost at the bottom. It's not quite in Korea. I don't have Taiwan Taiwan represented here, but Taiwan I think would be lower still than Hong Kong, and Korea. But this high swift change from childbearing, from high childbearing, high number of children to replacement fertility is the hallmark of what demographers call the second demographic transition, because fertility reaches replacement, and the challenge now is to try to figure out how to raise fertility, and we can I'll come back to that point in a few minutes. Everywhere, almost everywhere, non-marital childbearing is rising. Non-marital childbearing is making up some of the loss of marital childbearing in most countries. But in Asia, these are the three Asian countries, Korea, Japan, and next to it is Turkey. I said three, but next to it is Turkey. There's virtually no non-marital childbearing. That is, it really doesn't take if you go to the other end and look at Mexico, Costa Rica, Chile, almost all of the childbearing now occurs outside of wedlock. And I referred to this earlier, the growing degree of childlessness for a particular birth cohort. And this is the most recent birth cohort going up to 1980. the people who were born in 1980 and now are pretty much at the end of their period of childbearing women, we see again where, we see again where Hong Kong and Japan stand in this childlessness. And again, Hong Kong is distinctively high. And I probably am saying this to people who know it all too well, but look at how you compare with the rest of the world in almost a third of the women compared to generally 20% elsewhere, and going down to, in some countries, to under 5% of women who are childless at the end of their childbearing period. So, and here I want to add a slide from the US that I find particularly dramatic. This looks at 3 age periods, 1960, 2000, and 2010, and it records, the bars record the number of people, the darkest bars, the maroon bar, reports the number of people in 1960, the number of men and women who had gone through the complete, all of those stages, all of those events that make up the transition to adulthood, home leaving, entering the labor force, marriage, and so on. About 3/4 of men and women in the United States by age 35 in 1960 had navigated all of those events, compared to 42% of men and 55% of women in 2010. This is a dramatic change in a very short period of time, and it has strong implications for public policy, because when adolescence ends, adulthood does not begin any longer, which was the case when I was a lad. But now there's a period that we sometimes call young adulthood, where there is an effort to establish some basis of security and to try to form relationships. But that takes place over, instead of swiftly as it did in the late teens and very early 20s, 50, 60 years ago, it now takes place over about a 10-year period. So what are the sources, to some extent, the mediators of change? Why has this occurred, and how is it occurring, and why does it differ from country to country? Those are the questions that I and my colleagues are currently exploring in a study of global family change. But certainly our hypothesis is that, as was William J. Good's 50 years ago, 50 plus years ago, was that market capitalism is a driving force, along with today changing technology and the role of digitization and the media. But there's also a wave of cultural change in many countries, in particular around women's rights and gender equity, that is clashing with embedded patriarchal systems that have been in place for hundreds and, in some cases, thousands of years. Market capitalism undermines family authority by, in some sense, the families no longer control the job system as they do in a predominantly agricultural system. Instead, education is the route to job success, and education means that parents are often indirectly guiding their children rather than directly controlling them and placing them. And along with another corollary of this is that market capitalism produces high rates of geographical mobility. People move to urban areas and the like, or immigrate to other countries. This both slows down the process of marriage and childbearing, and it also it provides opportunities that are often far removed from what parents can provide. Another factor that plays or interacts with these changes is the policy positions that different countries have. Some countries have promoted gender equality vigorously, others have laid back and taken a more passive approach. Legal responses to such things as abortion, or the availability of contraception have varied from country to country, and to some extent one can trace the effects of these policies as they emerge or fail to emerge. And I already mentioned technology and the changing social media, which we do not fully understand how that is interplay, what the interplay between social media and social change is, but we know it's a rapidly occurring. And when I was in Vietnam earlier this year and talking to groups of people about this topic of family change, one young man raised his hand and said, "We get everything we know from social media." And I think so the spread of information, the leaping across national boundaries, is a very powerful force in today's world. And finally, I should say that change operates a little differently depending on the demography of the family. And we know that in both the West and the most advanced countries in Asia, there is rapid aging, which was referred to earlier. And this has profound implications for how the family is going to be able to respond to the task of caring for the elderly, because in virtually every society, the family plays a powerful role, especially, I dare say, in Asia. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the process of change and how it's occurring, a topic that maybe is more interesting to academics than to policy or practice people, but it fascinates us how the family adapts to changing environmental circumstances. I already mentioned that the job economy begins to undermine part of the authority of elders, and particularly males. Education as a institution and as a process is rapidly revising young people's aspirations and plans and expectations for the future. And of course, the global information system that I just referred to is altering tastes and expectations as well. One of my heroes, C. Wright Mills, intellectual heroes, C. Wright Mills, made this statement of when time-honored traditions can no longer be honored, their contradictions surface, bubble up in societies, and have to be resolved. gender equality, the fight for gender equality is just such a contradiction between modern expectations of human capital use and more traditional ones of a sharply defined gender-based division of labor. When I was doing research in the United States, I had a ringside seat to watching these expectations change. I was studying teenagers who became pregnant before the age of, while they were by the age of 18, and their families' response, and I followed a cohort of teenage mothers over a 30-year period and their children. And I was astounded, this was in the middle 60s, to discover that I could almost witness the change that was occurring in marriage, where the daughters, the pregnant teens, were wishing to get married, and their parents, who had had the experience sometimes themselves of an early pregnancy and a marriage that didn't work out, were saying to the teenagers, wait, complete your education first. The father will be there for you if you do, and if he's not, he won't be there anyhow. So I was watching that going on. I had a ringside seat, and the contradiction between early marriage that had been a widespread practice, and as I said earlier, sexual risk-taking in the context of early marriage. The rug was pulled out from under these young women who had expected to get married and no longer found that their partners were able to support them in the way that perhaps had once been the case. Now I want to move to a topic that is, I think, of utmost importance. It may play out differently in Asia than it seems to be playing out in the West, and particularly in my, I always say the US is something of an outlier as a country, so don't generalize from what's happening in the United States. But I'm steeped in the experience of the United States, and I know that one of the consequences of this change in the family system has been to create really a class-based family system, which was not the case 50, 60, 70 years ago. Everybody married then, and we're seeing the emergence of this two-tiered family system. The top tier applies to privileged families. The bottom tier, I would just say, less privileged on a kind of continuum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that is operating, because to a greater or lesser extent, you're going to, many countries in Asia are going to have to deal with the stratification, the growing levels of inequality. And the family change is both a consequence of inequality and a cause of inequality. I think it is pointless to try to say, is it a cause or is it a consequence? It is an iterative system where as family systems begin to become differentiated, they become more particular and more specific to certain economic strata. And I think it's an open question whether this two-tier family system will emerge in a place like Hong Kong that is relatively wealthy and committed to a kind of a lot of mobility within the society, and as the minister said, not discarding human capital, regarding it as the country's most precious resource. I dare say that in America we don't have as enlightened an attitude. So will this two-tiered family system emerge in Asia? I don't know, but we can open that up for discussion. What creates it is both response to opportunity and also a family socialization pattern, and principally an education, the differences in the length and intensity of education. And I think one might differentiate this two-tier family system by saying that for the privileged, the top tier, the system works pretty much as it did a half-century ago. The only thing that's changed is that there is more cohabitation and later marriage, but childbearing does not occur before marriage. In the bottom tier, which might include large parts of the middle working class and much of poor families, most of poor families, we have something that's closer to a matrilineal model where people look to their kin for support and do not expect a marriage to be as strong enough and reliable enough to provide the support for childbearing and child rearing. And one can ask, is this a cultural change or a structural change? In the US, and I would guess here in Asia, people argue constantly about whether these changes are coming about through a shift in cultural standards and tastes and expectations, or whether they arise because of structural constraints that come with lack of resources and access to resources, which is principally involves access to education. I think it's a mindless debate. I think both of these factors are operating in tandem, and they're creating a system that is going not to be easy to erase or to change. So the privileged family form is one where there's intense investment in children. You know it well. It is what we saw, the tiger mother, but it is what my colleague Annette Leroux calls concerted cultivation, a child-centered, parent-intense, beginning before birth, childbearing classes. There's a whole array of preparatory activity among privileged. Birth is almost always planned rather than unplanned, intended, timed. There's a large amount of social capital to support the young couple and their offspring, and the families are keenly involved in managing their social environments and managing what their children do and placing them in opportunistic settings that provide rich possibilities for building social capital. You know it well, I think. This is consistent with a lengthy transition to adulthood. There's a good deal of prelude. I used to say when I taught the family sociology, first people get together, then they get a pet, and then they start thinking of having a child. It's a late marriage pattern, so there's been a lot of selection and for the lawyers in here, due diligence and looking at potential partners. And so, not surprisingly, we've seen the rate of divorce go down at the top of the social structure, while it's going up at the bottom, reversing a pattern that was true 50 or 60 years ago. And as I said, parenthood is almost invariably Planned Parenthood. The counterpart form that is less advantaged, often pregnancies in the U.S. and I certain growing number of European countries are occurring somewhat earlier, not as early as they used to. In the U.S., fertility is unplanned largely. Cohabitation, instead of being a prelude to marriage, for many people it becomes an alternative to marriage, with a greater level of instability than we've known even in marriage systems. So unrecorded divorce is extremely high for these families. And what I think is very relevant, and maybe less so in Asia, is the growth of complex families, childbearing across several partnerships, which is very common among less educated Americans now. Somewhere of 40% of men have 2 or more children from 2 or more women. And likewise, women are managing children from more than one relationship. It's clear that in these families that are already under-resourced, this pattern is devastating in a certain way, because it really challenges the parent to find enough resources and enough attention for their children. And so there is a lower development of human, social, and cultural capital, leading to lower opportunities in advancing in educational systems, and hence lower social mobility. Again, I don't say this will happen in a country like Hong Kong, in a nation like Hong Kong, but I think there'll be tendencies that push in that direction between the haves and the have-nots, if only because the privileged, the well-off families are forging ahead, doing everything they can think of to have their children prepared for schooling and to sustain them successfully in the educational process. So I'd say a word about families in the middle, and then I'm going to make a couple of policy comments and conclude. The families, the middle class in the US, and to some extent in Anglo countries more broadly, has been a vanishing form, because the jobs that have sustained middle class workers there's less pay for those jobs, and fewer opportunities for advancement, for career advancement. Especially if, and here when I'm talking about the middle, I'm talking about people without a college education. They may have some college, they may have a high school graduation, but they are contending with a lack of resources to compete in a ever more demanding labor market. And similarly with that, parental knowledge, skills, and access to resources become attenuated, and represent another challenge for parents to find the routes to find the support in the school system, to find the opportunities outside of the school system for connecting their children with avenues of advancement. A few, yes, it's going to be excellent. I'm right there. I may even end 5 minutes early. So we have a number of policy choices for the future that represent different kinds of futures. What kind of society, and I think we heard this morning, strong pronouncements of commitments to use government resources to assist families with limited means, to enabling them to compete to have their children successfully compete in the world of education and work. A lot of this is going to depend on how we resolve, and I think there are a bunch of interesting questions in Asia, particularly having to do with how we manage how early sexuality is managed as the age of marriage goes up to 30. It's pretty clear that most people are not going to wait. So how do we manage reproductive health? And are we doing a good job? Some countries are doing an excellent job. Other countries, I include my own, doing a poor job of managing this fertility, potential of fertility outside of marriage. The issue that I've discovered is predominant in Asia, how to manage gender relationships that has impact on work and family, on motherhood, on time available, and so on. This is the issue that I think many of you have been contemplating and for your society. And how the society manages that, it depends to a great extent on political will and the country and the voices of women. In large parts of Asia, there's embedded patriarchy, which resists gender equality and creates challenges for women who want to work and parent at the same time. That I think is particularly true here. The second issue that is particularly true here is how to manage intergenerational relations in a world where the number of children is small and the number of living parents and even grandparents is growing. And that, as women work, try to balance their family responsibilities to their children, but also gain a large stake in a new portfolio of managing their parents as they encounter illness. That's truly a challenge for this nation. Whether countries are going to see the kind of taxing and redistributive policies that were mentioned before earlier this morning is not yet completely known. In many countries, I hear a strong commitment to a redistributive policy here in Hong Kong. So those are the issues I throw out before you. I hope this sets the context for some of the parenting issues that we're going to discuss in the next 2 days, and I thank you, and I welcome questions at the appropriate time, and I don't know whether this is the appropriate time. It is the appropriate time.
Frank, if I may.
Yes, you may.
Yeah, I really, really enjoy your talk. I think, as you said, it really sets a good scenes for the next sort of 2 questions, Frank, again, to sort of kick off the discussion. I am fascinated by your discussion about the privileged, middle, and the less privileged kind of tier approach to family situation. You haven't made comments about that, but I'd love to hear. You haven't made any comments about in relation to newly arrived migrants. You haven't talked about couple with wide age gap. You haven't talked about family with children with disability, for example. Are you seeing pattern more in those directions, I wonder? Please.
Well, is this on? Good. I think you raised, Sampson, some excellent questions. I haven't talked about the immigrant populations and the rapid shifting of population groups across the world. And I think, just to be brief about that, we've discovered in the U.S. that our immigrant population, in some sense, is more easily assimilated into the, especially the Asian immigrants, but even immigrants from Latin America, have had a considerable success, in part because immigration often selects people who are highly committed to seeing their children have a future and highly committed to making sacrifices in behalf of their children. So I think we're seeing at least the first wave of immigration having a fair amount of success in the United States. With each successive wave of immigration, with each successive generation, once the immigrant has come, the prospects actually diminish from the first to the second to the third generation. And so we see the people who are not experiencing upward mobility often face some downward mobility or inability to climb out of some impoverished situations. As far as families with disabilities, there is a kind of interaction between what I was talking about and having a disabled child. The privileged families have possibilities, resources, connections that really are likely to make a big difference. Whereas many of the, at least in our country, many of the people with meager resources, less education, are facing big challenges in trying to get help for their children. So there is an interaction between an emerging class-based family system and the problems that the issues for problem children or children with problems.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, guys, pretty much I open the forum, so Mr. Yu, please.
Thank you, Frank, for your inspiring presentation. I'm quite interested in how the political recent changes around the globe affect the family patterns and the relationship between the parents and their children.
I
in
missed
Hong
the
Kong,
first part. How the
political changes.
Okay.
Okay. Now,
Political
you know, in Hong Kong, 2 years ago, we have the umbrella movement.
right.
Right.
And creating a lot of conflicts between the government authority and the younger generation. But this is not the whole story. We have also a lot of conflicts. I think most of them arising from political ideology differences between the parents
Right.
and the younger generation.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
have you observed the same similar global patterns? Because we also know there are also a lot of youth movements around the
Right.
world.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. we don't need to worry about umbrella. The weather will be just perfect. Frank, your response, please. Political change.
Well, I was hoping to get a yellow umbrella before I left.
No, please.
It's a very good question that
Yes,
you raise, and it's an interesting question about the extent to which young people will become politically active when they have a longer period of youth residing in this period of young adulthood.
Transition.
And I think that is going to happen. I think what also happens is that there is a discrepancy between the education of the young people and the older generation, which creates a kind of particular circumstance under which political protest has some special salience. I wish it were the case in the U.S. where we need a active young population actively involved in politics to get more involved. In large part, I think the societies that provide education and support for the young people are going to see an actively involved, a politically involved younger generation. I think that's a concomitant and associated with the growth of higher education. We experienced it in the U.S. in the 1960s when education expanded rapidly, and you had a large group in the colleges and universities that were politically activated, and I think that's certainly going to happen in many countries. We've seen it, in the Arab Spring, we saw much the same thing.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, maybe one last one or two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Professor Black. You cite the privileged family form and a disadvantaged family form, but I'm very interested in the families in the middle. So do you have the good advice? You say there's something pulled in both directions. How to, do you give some good advices on families in middle school? And you say late marriage and planned parenthood and something more about it. Thank you.
Yes, I can say both. Let me start with the middle group of families that I say are pulled in both directions. Their aspirations are to see their children go to college, to succeed, and they make considerable sacrifices in behalf. The reality is that many of these families cannot support their children in the style of privileged families. They don't have the money to pay tuitions. They don't have the money. They may be able to help out in housing their children while they go to school, but it means a local education rather than a more privileged education. Which involves going away often from home. So these families are overstressed, and I've been doing a qualitative study with some students of mine on middle-income families, and we find that over time, the children begin to downgrade their expectations. At the beginning, when they were still in high school, they wanted to complete college. Now they only want to get to a community college, and they can't afford to go to a four-year college. So we're seeing that kind of downward trajectory for many of these families. Now, on the issue of later parenting, I think that has profound implications for the quality of parenting. There is a combination of later and what happens during the process of, let's say, the 5 years between 50 years ago, they would have had their first child at 23. Now it's 28 or 30. That means more education. It means more experience. It means more association with like-minded families. So to some extent, I can't demonstrate this, but I would guess that there's much more class homogeneity in where people now live and where they send their children to school. So it among this privileged group, the children are going to privileged schools with peers that are also privileged. So there's an aggregate effect that is larger than the individual effect of the family alone.
Thank you very much, Frank.